Right now, obviously, Russia is in a different situation, but the level of interest in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan has grown quite a lot in the last several years.
Can you please just briefly give me a little bit of your background? Like, how were you involved in Central Asia? I see you have about 23 years plus experience, like you have mentioned in your LinkedIn profile. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, no, I've been working in emerging markets actually for more than 40 years. Before coming to the Eurasia region, I worked for 8 years in the Gulf in Abu Dhabi and also a couple of years in Thailand. So I came to Moscow first in February '98, so 26 years ago since I arrived. And obviously, at that time, and I guess for the noughties, the main focus was on Russia. It was the big market. It was the one that all international investors were looking at. But over the last sort of dozen years, I guess, particularly since 2014, international investors and multinationals have been expanding into Central Asia, specifically, of course, Kazakhstan first and the Caucasus. And then since late 2016, since the election of President Mirziyoyev, have been looking much more actively at Uzbekistan. So that kind of, to a large extent, we follow where our clients go. And as the interest from our clients, which are all multinationals, they're all big household names in oil and gas or healthcare or consumer areas or agriculture, all these big areas. When our clients look at new markets, then we go with them and provide coverage and analysis and strategic kind of project analysis for them in those markets. So right now, obviously, Russia is in a different situation, but the level of interest in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan has grown quite a lot in the last several years.
I heard I saw your interview with Al Jazeera, quite controversial, I would say, with the debate going on, with multiple, your counterparts having their own significant opinions about the economy of Russia. How do you see that?
Yeah, look, it can be quite frustrating to hear a lot of to hear opinions about what's happening in Russia, but also in the region from people who really don't spend any time there. They engage in what I refer to as political economics, which basically means that they have a political view, which from the West these days is mostly negative about Russia and mostly positive about Central Asia. And they look for data points to support that political view. So in other words, they will, in the case of Russia, they will look for negative data points and almost ignore anything else and just use that then as justification for the kind of political bias. So I come up against it a lot where people have the sense that, well, the Russian economy must be doing badly, people must be suffering, there must be a great deal of suppression and government controls because that's what they expect from a country involved in a conflict. And of course, that's not the case. The reality is that the economy in Russia has certainly changed. It is, if you like, suffering from the effects of the conflict and the fact that the budget has been so changed to support the military-industrial complex. But these are more medium to long-term negatives. Over the short term, the government has been very careful to kind of maintain, I guess, suppose you say, stability. In that, the shops are pretty much full of the same sort of products that you would have expected 3 years ago. Of course, Russia does have a problem with demographics, as we know, and has a very tight labor force, which means that unemployment is less than 3% in the country and wages are going up in real terms, which has a positive short-term effect in terms of stability and people have money to spend. But of course, longer term, this is a problem. And that's the message I've tried to kind of convey when I'm talking to people about what the situation in Russia today is, that the government has managed to stabilize the economy, has been very fortunate in terms of being able to find new markets for particularly oil, but other key commodities, which means that it's earning good foreign trade money earnings, and the budget is doing well. So it's able to fund the military-industrial complex. It's able to fund social programs. It's able to fund real growth in incomes and in pensions, all of which contributes to this kind of current stability. But the problem is, as you go forward, the impact of sanctions, the loss of foreign kind of expertise, foreign companies, foreign partnerships, foreign investment, all of that will have a negative effect. So the longer this conflict goes on, the more likely the Russian economy is to slide into stagnation and find itself in a kind of much more difficult situation, which will take longer to pull out of. In other words, the technology gap between Russia and the rest of the world will grow. Russian kind of industry will be left behind, and essentially, therefore, the products and the services that the government can provide people in the next few years will be a lot less than they're used to, and a lot less than would be the case without the conflict. So it's that kind of tail end negative rather than a current. I think that there was a sense in Europe that this kind of 18,000 sanctions that were applied to Russia in the last 2 years would collapse the economy, would bring the country to its knees, and would bring people out into the streets protesting against the government. And I have to say, I sense a level of frustration and maybe disappointment in talking to people in Europe and in the US that hasn't happened. And to some extent, they believe that the numbers are wrong. It must be happening. And you try to explain that it's not. It's a longer term effect rather than a short term. So, yeah, it's I spend about a third of my time in Moscow and about half my time then in Central Asia, in Tashkent, Almaty, Baku and Astana in particular, and then maybe a little bit more traveling to see clients in Europe. So, it's my time is now spread much more in Central Asia, which reflects the fact that our clients are also spending more time. They have kind of settled their business in Russia, those that have remained, and it's now on a kind of more maintenance basis, but they're looking for new opportunities in Central Asia.
One thing that I have realized, if you see a curve from the start of the Ukraine and Russia conflict up until now, and especially with the conflict between Israel and Palestine, there has been a shift in political narrative. Like if you see initially when Ukraine and Russian conflict started off, people were pro Ukraine, pro US, pro you can say like Western. I should choose my words. Narrative, Yes. So, but when you consider like slowly the shift started to go down more towards Russia because of the economic downfall that US was suffering and the amount of economic impact that it had on the whole of EU. And especially with the rise of social media, a lot of social media influencers within US and within European countries started to rise and question the decisions and the amount, the way the Western world has been trying to influence this conflict. But now with the Israel and Palestine, and recently, if you have heard the Tucker Carlson interview, I feel like just before this, I would say maybe like a couple of months back, things have started to shift a little bit more again, with a few Russian politicians maybe indirectly or directly trying to say that Central Asian countries are dependent on Russia, and it would be better if there was a new Soviet kind of a system going on. So I feel like a lot of this has raised a lot of questions in the minds of Central Asian countries, especially with the narrative that the general public had, So, but at the same time, I've seen that the diplomatic relations between Russia and Central Asian countries, EU and Central Asian countries, China and Central Asian countries, and now the Belarusian president coming to Uzbekistan and visiting a few Central Asian countries as well. it's very unpredictable that what is going to happen. So what is
Sure.
your take on that?
Okay, first of all, I would caution against paying too much attention what, say, nationalist politicians or populist TV media hosts say in Russia. We have become used to this, not just in the last couple of years, but maybe even since 2014. You hear kind of almost crazy statements, but certainly alarmist statements about what Russia should do. Maybe even invading the Baltic states, or as you say, recreating the Soviet Union, or Russia having greater control in Central Asia. So we've become used to a lot of these type of statements, and I would say to you more often than not, you should just dismiss them as populist rhetoric, and not even populist rhetoric, because it's not what I hear from Russian people. It's not the general view that I hear in talking to Russians in Moscow or other cities that I visit. Nobody has this view, but you do hear these days, and also even from ex-president or former president Dmitry Medvedev. You know that quite regularly he issues tweets, kind of warning of nuclear war with the West and threatening NATO, etc. So we've become used to this kind of, background kind of alarmist type rhetoric. But so it's always more important to pay attention to what the government officials are saying, what ministers are saying, what people in the administration and the Kremlin are saying, and the narrative there is different. It's not about let's go and invade Central Asia or rebuild the Soviet Union, but it is about building more relationships in Central Asia. Let's face it, Russia now is in a position where even with the best will in the world, it's going to take a very long time to repair relations with Europe and with the West. Even if the conflict were to end this year, it's going to be a long time. So instead, Russia is looking to build new relations. Obviously, the expansion of the BRICS format, which brought in Egypt and Saudi Arabia and the Emirates and Iran, a couple of other countries this year. But Russia is definitely looking to strengthen its position in terms of trade and investment within the BRICS format, but particularly in Central Asia. But it is looking to do it in terms of economic interaction, economic exchanges, and increasing trade, not kind of politically or militarily. So, for example, we have now a deal between Russia and Uzbekistan for the supply of gas. Which is, we don't know what the price is. It's never been disclosed, but we assume it's at a discount to the price that Russia used to charge Europe, because that would be normal. And we see other efforts, obviously the level of investment from maybe Russian companies and Russian entrepreneurs or oligarchs in Kazakhstan, in Uzbekistan, increasing. So I think that's the Kremlin view, is that if it can increase trade and perhaps energy subsidies and investment, then to some extent that strengthens the relationship. It means that President Mirziyoyev is not going to stand up in the United Nations and condemn Russia, in the same way President Tokayev of Kazakhstan does not stand up in the UN and condemn Russia. Of course, they don't agree with what's happening in Ukraine, or they don't agree with Russia's geopolitical stance, but they have a more neutral kind of position with regard to Russia when it comes to the narrative internationally. So Russia for sure is looking at Central Asia and I guess the Caucasus as well as the Middle East as an area where it wants to expand in the future in terms of trade and investment, because it's now blocked from the West. Also, Moscow is, I would say, somewhat wary of Beijing, even though that might seem strange given that the level of trade between the two countries has expanded so much, over $200 billion last year. And clearly the trade with China, India to some extent has helped Russia survive the last couple of years. But Moscow is wary about being too dependent on China. As you know, culturally there's always a suspicion between Russians and Chinese anyway, and that really hasn't changed a lot on the street. And people, the Russian people are wary about becoming too dependent on China, too close to China. And we see that in therefore the efforts from the Kremlin to look to diversify. They would much rather have stronger and bigger relations in Central Asia, in the Middle East, Iran and India to balance what has now become a very strong relationship with China. But the bottom line is, I think, despite these kind of alarmist statements from Duma deputies and from some late night TV hosts, etc., the position of the Kremlin, I think, is quite clear in that it wants to strengthen and keep strong the relationships in Central Asia by expanding trade and investment and subsidies and tying it in that way. I don't see any evidence of any kind of other kind of political or military kind of ambition or design. So there's just no evidence of that. It's about trade and tying in those trade economic relations.
I've seen, like in Central Asia in past, I would say maybe a decade, that there's been a lot more attraction from both European Union side and even Russia and China.
Yes.
Why do you see the importance, and what importance do you see in Central Asia when it regards to big economic hubs like Russia, China, and European Union?
Yeah, there's a couple of factors. One is, let's just say, it's geopolitical. Of course, the when you look at a map, Central Asia is to a large extent the middle of the world. It's certainly the middle of when you take Europe, Asia, Middle East, Africa. If you look at that part of the map, then Central Asia is pretty much in the middle. It's I guess to take a phrase from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, it is Middle Earth. So in that sense, obviously Europe and the West want to have a presence in this very important region. And the fact that we are seeing such an expansion of connectivity, in other words, rail lines like the BRI system from China, the International North-South Transport Corridor, which is linking Russia with southern Iran and then to India. And now we see Europe building what they call the Middle Corridor, a route to bypass Russia for trade between Europe and China, and then several other routes that are proposed. Of course, China through Uzbekistan down to the Gulf. Lots of routes. So there's a great deal of connectivity with all these transport corridors being built across the region, which opens up the region quite a bit, and also makes it a very, very important transport route, particularly for Europe. And the Middle Eastern states looking to trade with China and to Asia. You have to transit to Central Asia, and that makes it very important. But then separate to that, I think Europe and the US, we've seen in the last 6 months in particular, have really woken up to the potential of Central Asia as being a source of what is now referred to as critical minerals. So it's minerals that are used and metals that are used in technology, obviously in electric vehicles, lithium, for example, but a whole range of other rare earth metals and other so-called critical minerals that now mainly come from China to Europe and to the US, and some from Russia and some from other countries. But the US Geological Society, I guess regarded as being the main agency globally for looking at metals and minerals around the world. They've identified Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan to some extent, as being locations where Europe and the US could find alternative supplies of a lot of these rare earth metals as they want to reduce their dependency on China as a source of these metals. So, for example, this year we see that there are several official delegations being organized by both the US and by the European Union to come to Central Asia to look at the potential for investing in these so-called critical minerals. So that's, and then of course uranium, I guess, is part of that, because we know the uranium that's used in nuclear power plants in Europe and the US comes from Russia. And both Europe and the US are looking for alternatives. Kazakhstan, of course, is a big producer of uranium, but Uzbekistan also, and can be bigger. So it's a combination, therefore, of location. Central Asia is right between Europe and Asia, therefore it's an important area for Europe and the West to have good political relations and have strong, connectivity with, because it's the second part being the fact that we have all of these expanding transport links, and it's a vital junction in many ways. I'm not going to exaggerate to say that we should look at it in the same way as maybe the Suez Canal or the Straits of Malacca, but the volume of trade crossing Central Asia is going to grow, quite a lot over the next decade, and it will become, a critical trade route between Europe and Asia, and as important in many ways particularly for high value goods. For fast delivery goods, it'll become as important as, say, the Suez or others. So they need to be there. And then, as I say, as a source of critical minerals and uranium and other materials that where Europe and the US wants to at least diversify their supply risk. And then you look at the market potential, particularly as Uzbekistan, which has got one of the fastest growing populations in the world. It's already now the biggest population in the Eurasia region, which we include Ukraine in the Eurasia region. We cover Ukraine as well. But obviously the Ukrainian population has gone down quite a lot because of migration.
Yeah.
And, so now today, Uzbekistan has got the biggest population in the Eurasia region, and it is the fastest growing. So therefore, it's a very big market for European companies. Looking to consumer goods, services, healthcare, construction, real estate. These are attractive markets for multinationals to expand into, apart from the geopolitical and kind of strategic supply angle. So yeah, I think you could certainly say, without exaggerating, you could say that we are now in the decade of Central Asia. It's almost like the last major economic area that's opening up to the world. I know you say like Africa and other places are still very undeveloped, but there are reasons they're undeveloped. But if you look at, kind of what's happening in Central Asia, it is certainly now the high growth or the emerging high growth economic region in the world. And that, of course, is why it's of particular interest to all these kind of big investment groups in the West and in Asia, and of course Russia always.
But what about political uncertainty? I feel like this region, even though there is a huge potential and it is emerging market, the main concern for the delay in Central Asia being the emerging market has been political alliances within Central Asia, and all the, as my previous interviewee stated, this whole region has been chaotic. So has been, yes.
Yes,
So
and you're right. It is a factor. When you look at, if you talk to a multinational or to a strategic investor about any location, wherever it is, there are two critical factors. There are two boxes that have to be ticked. One is economic predictability, and the other is political stability. And they both need to be ticked. Now, it doesn't matter if you can make a great case for investing in, the mining sector in Uzbekistan or some other area, if the government is unstable and the investment climate is unstable, they're not going to come, no matter how attractive that investment is. So you need the economic predictability and be able to calculate, what is the economy going to look like in 5 years' time? What is the currency exchange rate going to be? What does inflation look like? All of these economic kind of considerations need to be understood, and as I say, they need to be relatively stable. But the political angle, particularly in emerging markets, is even more important, and you're quite right to highlight that, because of course emerging markets and political instability have always kind of almost gone hand in glove. And excuse me, and I guess when you look at Central Asia, we're still dealing with almost the legacy or the tail end of the Soviet transition. Like President Mirziyoyev, he's that generation. Obviously he was in government with President Karimov. And it's a transition government from the Soviet system to what people in Uzbekistan and investors hope will be kind of a more open society, a more democratic society, a kind of freer society, and you're not there yet. It's absolutely right, and it's certainly one of the areas that we get asked about, and it's certainly an area of criticism, is our questions. One is, what is the political succession? Clearly, we can see President Mirziyoyev is very much in control, just as President Tokayev is very much in charge of Kazakhstan, and President Rahman even more so, I guess, in Tajikistan. So people ask, well, what is the succession? What comes after these leaders? And it's very difficult to answer that. In fact, it's impossible to answer that right now, because there is no, you've got strong leaders with no obvious succession. And that certainly concerns investors, because they worry about what would happen tomorrow if those leaders were to leave suddenly, for example, or even when their time is up, what happens? So that needs to be addressed, and there needs to be kind of a greater clarity on the political system and the transitory system, and if you like, what happens next, as it were, that maintains that political stability. The second question we get asked about and concern is, there are reports of more and more government control over the internet, over social media. Obviously, Kyrgyzstan is much worse, where there is a real suppression of journalists and of media and arrests of journalists. And that also raises questions. And there's a lot of big multinational companies that won't invest in countries, where these are major considerations. Suppression of freedom of speech, suppression of people's internet, control of internet. That raises a great deal of concern, because the companies worry that that there could be what now appears to be kind of an open political system under President Mirziyoyev could quickly deteriorate. If, for example, the economy were to deteriorate, or people were to protest over lack of delivery on income or of jobs or something else, then what the government might do to control that, and that worries companies. And then the other area, actually, I have to say, particularly with regard to Uzbekistan, is there's always questions over the emerging oligarchs. And there is definitely a suspicion that one of the reasons, for example, why privatization has taken so long and why it's been delayed so long, despite the fact that the president has talked about it as a priority for many years, that one of the reasons why it's been delayed is because local oligarchs are emerging and they want to get their hands on the best assets before then bringing in foreign investors. So, and these are typical. I'm not saying that these are unique to Uzbekistan, or in any way implying that this is worse in Uzbekistan than other countries. It is more of a feature of Central Asia. We saw it in Russia as it was developing, and to some extent you can, without the kind of crazy politics and without the military, but in terms of the development of the economy and the emergence of the oligarchs and how the economy developed, it's not that unusual compared to other emerging markets that we've seen in Latin America and Asia. There tends to be a process. There are obviously local differences and local nuances and personalities, but the process tends to be the same in a developing economy as it goes through various stages and eventually emerges as a kind of more stable and predictable economy for investors. And Central Asia is going through that. But at the same time, it means that the government does now have to not only focus on the economy, which I think is maybe it's natural, and we hear that from President Mirziyoyev when he makes a speech at the major Astana Forum every year. He talks about economic issues. He talks about the plans for improving incomes in the country and making it a high-income country and creating diversification. He talks a great deal about economics, which is fine, but he now needs to start focusing on more political structures and addressing that kind of political stability angle that I referred to. Investors need to know that the country is stable almost regardless of what happens to the current leadership, that there will be a process that will maintain that stability. And part of that is a concern about internet and social media and journalist suppression, which says it's now a big issue in Kyrgyzstan, not so much elsewhere, but it's something that investors and multinationals look at. It's not just all about the money for them. They won't come if there is an issue about political stability or about political control, even no matter how good the economy looks.
Thank you so much, Chris. Before we end, if you have a few short words on what might happen this year, if you are looking at something positive, a positive change in Central Asia, that would be nice.
Well, I think it's definitely 2024 is the Chinese year of the dragon, but I think in investments, 2024 could very well be the year of Central Asia for investment, particularly Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and Azerbaijan. And I put those three countries deliberately together because we are, as I mentioned earlier, we follow our investors. We follow where they ask us to go and provide work and coverage for them. And those are the three countries that absolutely stand out this year. And it's been building over the last couple of years, and I think it's now coming to a head. And I would think 2024 is going to be the year of investment in Central Asia.
Thank you so much, Chris. I really appreciate it.
You're most welcome. Anytime. Okay. Bye-bye.